What happens when a seemingly ordinary celebrity interview takes an unexpected turn, leaving an entire studio frozen in silence? What happens when two respected voices begin discussing a deeply personal topic, and every word suddenly feels charged with emotion? Before we dive into this story, make sure you subscribe to Prime Spotlight, hit the like button, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on celebrity interviews that become unforgettable moments. The familiar theme music of The View echoed through the studio as the audience erupted into applause. Bright lights swept across the stage while cameras glided into position, capturing every smile, every gesture, and every flicker of anticipation. At the iconic table sat the four hosts: Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, Sunny Hostin, and Sara Haines. They exchanged welcoming smiles as the countdown reached its final seconds. 5, 4, 3. The red camera light illuminated. Whoopi smiled toward the audience. "Good morning, everyone." The audience cheered. Joy leaned forward with a grin. "Today we have one of the most celebrated actresses of all time joining us." Sara nodded enthusiastically. "A true legend of stage and screen." Sunny added warmly, "Please welcome the incomparable Meryl Streep." The audience rose to its feet as Meryl Streep walked onto the stage. She waved graciously, her presence calm and commanding. She greeted each host with a warm embrace before taking her seat at the table. "Thank you so much for having me," Meryl said with a smile. "We're thrilled you're here," Whoopi replied. For the first several minutes, the conversation flowed easily. The hosts asked Meryl about her latest fictional film project, her decades-long career, and the challenges of balancing artistry with public life. Meryl answered thoughtfully, her voice measured and warm. "Every role teaches me something new," she explained. "I think acting is really about learning to listen." The audience applauded. Joy joked, "Well, if acting is about listening, you've been teaching the whole industry for decades." Laughter rippled through the studio. Meryl smiled modestly. "I'm still learning every day." Whoopi nodded. "That's probably why people connect with your work. There's always honesty in it." "I hope so," Meryl replied. The conversation continued comfortably. Sunny asked about Meryl's preparation for emotionally demanding roles. Sara asked how she maintained creativity after so many years in Hollywood. Meryl answered each question with humor and grace, and the audience responded warmly. Then Whoopi leaned back slightly and glanced at a note card resting beside her mug. The shift was subtle, but everyone at the table seemed to notice. Meryl's expression remained pleasant, though she tilted her head slightly, as if sensing the conversation was about to change direction. Whoopi looked up. "Meryl, can I ask you something a little more personal?" Meryl smiled politely. "You can ask." The audience chuckled softly. Whoopi continued. "You've spent so many years in the public eye, and people admire not only your work, but also your voice on important issues. Do you ever feel pressure to speak out on topics beyond acting?" The studio grew quieter. Meryl considered the question carefully. "I think anyone with a public platform has to think seriously about when and how they use it." Whoopi nodded. "So you believe public figures have a responsibility to speak out?" Meryl answered slowly. "I believe they have a responsibility to be thoughtful. But I don't think every public figure is obligated to comment on every issue." Sunny listened attentively. Sara folded her hands on the table. Joy glanced toward the audience, sensing the shift in energy. Whoopi leaned forward slightly. "But when someone has influence, doesn't silence sometimes send a message too?" A murmur moved through the audience. Meryl remained composed. "Silence can be interpreted in many ways," she said. "Sometimes it means someone is still learning. Sometimes it means they're being careful not to speak without enough understanding." Whoopi held her gaze. "But people often look to celebrities for leadership." Meryl nodded. "And that can be a heavy expectation." The audience applauded lightly. Whoopi smiled politely but continued. "Do you think there are moments when remaining silent can be harmful?" Meryl paused. The room became still. Finally, she answered. "Yes, I do think there are moments when silence can be harmful. But I also think there are moments when speaking without knowledge can be harmful." The audience reacted with a thoughtful murmur. Whoopi nodded slowly. "That's fair." But she wasn't finished. "So how does someone decide when to speak?" Meryl folded her hands. "I think you ask yourself whether you're contributing clarity or simply adding noise." The audience applauded more strongly. Joy smiled. "That's a good line." Whoopi chuckled softly. "It is." Then she added, "But some people might say that waiting for perfect clarity can become an excuse for avoiding difficult conversations." The applause faded. Meryl looked directly at Whoopi. I agree that avoiding difficult conversations is a problem, she said calmly. But I don't think thoughtfulness should be mistaken for avoidance. The audience fell silent again. Sunny glanced between the two women. Sara shifted slightly in her chair. Joy's expression became more attentive. Whoopi nodded. I see what you mean. Meryl continued gently. I think the challenge is that public conversations often reward speed more than reflection. People expect immediate answers, even when the issue is complex. Whoopi responded, but television and media often operate in real time. People want to know where public figures stand. Meryl smiled softly. And sometimes the most honest answer is, I'm still thinking about it. The audience applauded. Whoopi smiled, but her eyes remained thoughtful. That's an interesting perspective. Meryl nodded. I think certainty can be comforting. But certainty isn't always the same as wisdom. The audience reacted with a quiet, oh. Whoopi leaned back slightly, considering the statement. For a brief moment, the studio was completely silent. Then the applause began, hesitant at first, then growing louder. The cameras moved in closer, capturing the expressions around the table. What had started as a warm interview had become something more layered. A respectful but emotionally charged exchange about responsibility, influence, and the pressure of public expectation. And as the applause continued, everyone in the studio could sense that the conversation was only beginning. The applause gradually faded, but the atmosphere in the studio remained charged. What had begun as a warm and respectful interview had shifted into something more thoughtful and emotionally layered. The audience sat quietly, waiting for the next exchange, while the cameras moved carefully across the table to capture every expression. Whoopi Goldberg smiled politely, though her eyes remained focused on Meryl Streep. I appreciate your perspective, Whoopi said. And I think this is why these conversations matter. People want to understand how public figures think about their influence. Meryl nodded. And I appreciate the question, she replied. Because influence is complicated. It can be a gift, but it can also become a burden if people assume that being visible means being qualified to speak on every subject. Sunny Hostin leaned in slightly. That's an important distinction, Sunny said. But do you think there are moments when visibility itself creates a responsibility? Meryl considered the question. Yes, she answered. There are moments when a platform can be used to amplify important issues. But I think the responsibility is to be careful and informed, not simply to speak because silence might be criticized. The audience murmured thoughtfully. Sara Haines smiled. I think a lot of people can relate to that, Sara said. Sometimes we feel pressure to have an opinion immediately, even when we're still processing something. Meryl turned toward Sara. Exactly, she said. Reflection is often treated as hesitation, but reflection can be a form of respect. The audience applauded softly. Joy Behar grinned. Well, reflection is also what happens when I try to remember where I left my glasses. Laughter rippled through the studio, easing the tension for a moment. Meryl laughed warmly. That's a different kind of reflection, she joked. Whoopi smiled, but her expression soon became more serious. Meryl, let me ask you this, Whoopi said. Do you think audiences sometimes expect too much from celebrities? Meryl answered carefully. I think audiences often look for guidance from people they admire, she said. That's understandable. But admiration can sometimes turn into expectation, and expectation can become pressure. Whoopi nodded. So where should the line be drawn? Meryl folded her hands. I think the line should be drawn at authenticity, she replied. A person should speak when they have something meaningful to contribute, not simply because the public demands an immediate response. The audience listened closely. Sunny spoke again. But what about moments when silence is interpreted as indifference? Meryl looked directly at her. That's the difficult part, she said. Silence can be interpreted in many ways. But interpretation is not always the same as intention. A quiet murmur moved through the audience. Whoopi responded thoughtfully. That's true. But public figures also know that their silence may be interpreted by millions of people. Meryl nodded. Yes, she said. And that's why the decision to speak or remain silent can be very personal. It involves weighing responsibility, knowledge, timing, and the potential impact of one's words. Joy raised an eyebrow playfully. So basically, it's complicated. The audience laughed again. Meryl smiled. Very complicated. Whoopi leaned forward slightly. I think some people would say that waiting too long to speak can make a statement feel less sincere, Whoopi said. Meryl paused. That can happen, she admitted. But speaking too quickly can also make a statement feel less thoughtful. There's a tension between urgency and understanding. Sunny nodded slowly. That's a fair point. The audience applauded lightly. Sara added, it seems like what you're describing is the challenge of balancing authenticity with public expectation. Meryl smiled. Yes, she said. And I think that challenge exists for many people, not just celebrities. We all have moments when we're expected to respond before we fully understand what we're responding to. Whoopi considered this. But celebrities have a much larger platform, she said. Their words can influence public conversation in significant ways. Meryl agreed. They can, she said, which is why I believe the responsibility is not simply to speak, but to speak with care. The studio grew quieter. Whoopi asked another question. Do you think there are subjects on which every public figure should feel obligated to speak? Meryl thought for a moment. I think there are subjects that demand moral reflection, she said. But I would hesitate to say that every person must respond in the same way or at the same time. The audience reacted with thoughtful murmurs. Sunny looked intrigued. So you're saying the responsibility may be shared, but the expression of that responsibility can differ? Meryl nodded. Yes. I think responsibility can take many forms. For some people, it may mean speaking publicly. For others, it may mean supporting causes privately, listening carefully, or educating themselves before making a statement. Whoopi smiled slightly. That's a nuanced answer. Meryl returned the smile. It's a nuanced question. The audience applauded more strongly. Joy glanced around the studio. Joy said, I think everyone watching at home is probably having this debate with their television right now. Laughter spread through the audience. Whoopi chuckled. They probably are. Meryl laughed softly. And they may all reach different conclusions. Sunny smiled. That may be the healthiest outcome. For a brief moment, the conversation settled into a calmer rhythm. The hosts exchanged thoughtful glances, and the audience seemed to appreciate the respectful tone of the discussion. But then Whoopi returned to the central question. Meryl, she said gently, if a public figure chooses not to speak on a major issue, do you think they should explain that choice? The room grew quiet again. Meryl took a slow breath. Sometimes, she said, if the silence itself becomes part of the public conversation, an explanation may be appropriate. But I also think there should be room for people to say, I need more time to understand this fully. The audience listened intently. Whoopi nodded. That's an honest answer. Meryl smiled softly. I think honesty is the most important thing. Not certainty. Not speed. Honesty. The audience applauded. Sunny added, and honesty can include acknowledging uncertainty. Exactly, Meryl said. Sara smiled. I think that's something many people need to hear. Whoopi leaned back slightly. This has become a much deeper conversation than we probably expected when we started, she said. Joy laughed. That's what happens when you invite Meryl Streep. The audience laughed and applauded. Meryl smiled warmly. I'm happy to be part of the conversation. As the laughter faded, the cameras moved in closer once again. The discussion had become more than a simple interview. It had turned into a thoughtful exploration of influence, responsibility, and the pressure of public expectation. And although the tone remained respectful, everyone in the studio could sense that the conversation was building toward an even more revealing exchange. The studio lights seemed brighter now, reflecting off the polished table as the conversation deepened. The audience had grown remarkably quiet, listening to every exchange with the kind of attention usually reserved for a climactic moment in a film. The atmosphere was not hostile, but it was undeniably intense. Whoopi Goldberg looked across the table at Meryl Streep. I think what makes this conversation so compelling, Whoopi said, is that it touches on something many people struggle with: when to speak, when to listen, and how to know the difference. Meryl nodded. That's exactly the challenge, she replied. And I don't think there's a simple formula for it. Sunny Hostin leaned forward. But do you think public figures sometimes underestimate the impact of their silence? Sunny asked. Meryl paused before answering. I think that can happen, she said. But I also think people can overestimate the power of a single statement. Sometimes real change comes from sustained action, not just a public declaration. The audience murmured thoughtfully. Sara Haines smiled. That's an important distinction, Sara said. Words matter, but actions matter too. Meryl agreed. Absolutely. Ideally, the two should support each other. Joy Behar added with a grin. So the goal is not just to make a statement, but to make sure the statement means something. Laughter rippled through the studio. Meryl laughed softly. Yes, that's a very good way to put it. Whoopi's expression became more thoughtful. Meryl, let me ask you something more personal, Whoopi said. Have there been moments in your career when you felt pressure to respond publicly before you were ready? The room grew still. Meryl considered the question carefully. Yes, she said. There have been moments when I felt that pressure very strongly. And in those moments, I had to ask myself whether speaking immediately would actually contribute anything meaningful. Whoopi nodded. And what did you decide? Meryl smiled gently. Sometimes I spoke. Sometimes I waited. And sometimes I realized that listening was the most responsible thing I could do. The audience applauded softly. Sunny looked intrigued. That takes a lot of discipline, Sunny said. Especially when people are demanding a response. Meryl acknowledged the point. It can be difficult, she admitted, because public conversation often rewards speed. But wisdom rarely arrives on demand. A quiet, oh moved through the audience. Whoopi smiled. That's a powerful way to put it. Joy leaned back. I'm writing that down, she joked. The audience laughed, and the tension eased for a moment. But Whoopi returned to the subject with a thoughtful tone. I understand the value of reflection, Whoopi said. But I also think there are times when people need to hear where someone stands, even if the situation is complex. Meryl looked directly at her. I agree, she said. There are moments when clarity is necessary. My point is simply that clarity should come from understanding, not from fear of criticism. The audience applauded. Sunny nodded. That's an important distinction. Sara added. It sounds like you're saying the pressure to appear certain can sometimes interfere with genuine understanding. Meryl smiled. Yes, she said. And I think that pressure exists in many areas of life. People often feel they must have a definitive opinion immediately, even when they're still learning. Whoopi considered this. But some viewers might say that public figures have access to resources and information that allow them to respond more quickly. Meryl acknowledged the point. That's true in some cases, she said. But access to information doesn't automatically create understanding. Understanding requires time, context, and sometimes humility. The audience responded with thoughtful applause. Joy looked toward the audience. Joy said, I think a lot of people at home are probably realizing this conversation applies to them too. Whoopi smiled. It definitely does. Meryl nodded. I hope so, because this isn't just about celebrities. It's about how we all participate in public conversation. Sunny asked another question. How do you think social media has changed that pressure? Meryl's expression became reflective. I think social media has accelerated the expectation of immediate response, she said. People are often asked to react before they've had time to process, research, or reflect. Whoopi agreed. That's very true. Meryl continued. And while social media can be a powerful tool for awareness, it can also create an environment where nuance is difficult to maintain. The audience listened intently. Sara said, That seems especially challenging when the issue is emotionally charged. Exactly, Meryl replied. Strong emotions are understandable, but they can make it harder to have thoughtful conversations. Whoopi looked at Meryl with interest. So how should public figures navigate that environment? Meryl answered carefully. I think they should strive for honesty, humility, and consistency. If they choose to speak, their words should reflect genuine understanding. If they choose to wait, they should be transparent about why. Sunny nodded slowly. That makes sense. Joy smiled. And if they choose to say, I'm still figuring this out, that can be honest too. Meryl smiled warmly. Yes, I think acknowledging uncertainty can be a sign of integrity, not weakness. The audience applauded more strongly. Whoopi leaned back slightly. I think some people would find that reassuring, she said. We're so used to hearing confident opinions that we sometimes forget uncertainty can be honest. Meryl agreed. Uncertainty can be honest, and honesty is the foundation of trust. The studio fell quiet again. For a brief moment, the conversation seemed to settle into a shared understanding. The hosts exchanged thoughtful glances, and the audience appeared deeply engaged. Then Whoopi asked one final question. Meryl, if you could give one piece of advice to people who feel pressure to speak immediately on every issue, what would it be? Meryl took a slow breath. I would say, don't confuse urgency with wisdom, she said. Take the time to understand what you're responding to. Listen carefully. Learn as much as you can. And when you do speak, Make sure your words are coming from understanding rather than fear. The audience erupted into applause. Several people stood, clapping enthusiastically. Whoopi smiled warmly. That's a beautiful answer. Sunny nodded. It really is. Sara smiled. And I think it's a message many people needed to hear. Joy added with a grin. Well, I'm definitely using that at my next family dinner. Laughter filled the studio. Meryl laughed too. Use it wisely, she joked. As the applause continued, the cameras moved in closer, capturing the expressions of the hosts and the audience. The conversation had evolved into a thoughtful and emotionally resonant discussion about responsibility, influence, and the importance of reflection. And as the studio settled once more, it became clear that the final moments of the interview would determine how this conversation would be remembered. The applause gradually softened, but the energy in the studio remained unmistakably electric. The conversation had traveled far beyond the boundaries of a routine celebrity interview. It had become a thoughtful exchange about influence, responsibility, and the pressure of public expectation. Whoopi Goldberg looked around the table with a warm smile. I think this has been one of the most meaningful conversations we've had in a long time, Whoopi said. Not because everyone agreed on every point, but because everyone listened. The audience applauded. Meryl Streep nodded appreciatively. Thank you, Meryl replied. I think listening is often the most overlooked part of public conversation. Sunny Hostin smiled. And I think your point about reflection has resonated with a lot of people. Sara Haines added. It certainly resonated with me. I think many viewers can relate to the feeling of being pressured to have an immediate opinion. Joy Behar grinned. And if they can't relate to that, they can definitely relate to being asked a difficult question before they've had enough coffee. Laughter rippled through the studio, easing the intensity of the moment. Meryl laughed softly. That may be the most universal point we've made today. The audience laughed and applauded again. Whoopi turned back to Meryl. I appreciate that you were willing to engage with these questions, Whoopi said. Sometimes the most valuable conversations are the ones that require a little discomfort. Meryl nodded. I agree. Discomfort can be productive when it leads to deeper understanding. Sunny leaned in slightly. And I think what made this conversation powerful was that it stayed respectful, even when the questions became challenging. Meryl smiled. Respect is essential. Without it, conversation turns into performance. The audience murmured thoughtfully. Whoopi nodded. That's a strong statement. Meryl continued. I think public dialogue is healthiest when people feel safe enough to express uncertainty, ask questions, and change their minds if they learn something new. The audience applauded warmly. Sara smiled. That's a hopeful perspective. Joy added with a grin. And a difficult one for social media. Laughter spread through the studio. Whoopi chuckled. That's true. Meryl laughed. Very true. As the laughter faded, Whoopi became more reflective. Meryl, before we wrap up, I want to ask one final question, Whoopi said. After a conversation like this, what do you hope viewers take away from it? The studio grew quiet once more. Meryl paused, choosing her words carefully. I hope viewers take away the idea that thoughtful disagreement is not something to fear, she said. We can ask difficult questions. We can challenge each other respectfully. And we can still leave the conversation with greater understanding. The audience applauded. Meryl continued. I also hope people remember that public conversation does not have to be rushed. It is okay to take time to learn, reflect, and speak with care. Whoopi nodded. That's a valuable reminder. Sunny added. And I think it's especially important in a world where people often feel pressure to respond instantly. Meryl agreed. Yes, sometimes the most responsible response is to pause, listen, and seek understanding before speaking. The audience applauded again. Joy smiled. Well, I'm going to try that. No promises, but I'm going to try. The audience laughed warmly. Sara turned toward Meryl. Thank you for sharing your perspective so thoughtfully, Sara said. Thank you for having me, Meryl replied. I've appreciated the conversation. Whoopi smiled. And we've appreciated having you here. The audience rose to its feet in a standing ovation. The cameras captured the host smiling, Meryl waving graciously, and the audience applauding with genuine enthusiasm. As the show moved toward its closing moments, the producers in the control room exchanged impressed glances. That was something special, one producer whispered. Another nodded. It was intense, but in the best possible way. Within this fictional scenario, clips of the conversation quickly began circulating online. Viewers shared excerpts of Meryl's comments about reflection, honesty, and the importance of listening. Some praised Whoopi Goldberg for asking thoughtful questions that pushed the conversation deeper. Others applauded Meryl Streep for responding with calmness, nuance, and emotional intelligence. Many viewers highlighted the respectful contributions of Sunny Hostin, Sara Haines, and Behar, noting how each host helped shape the conversation without allowing it to become hostile. Entertainment commentators within this fictional story described the interview as a rare example of a televised discussion that remained compelling without relying on shouting or sensationalism. Social media users debated the central question of the conversation. Should public figures feel obligated to speak immediately on every major issue? Some viewers agreed with Meryl's emphasis on reflection and understanding. Others agreed with Whoopi's point that public influence can create a responsibility to respond. But many agreed on one thing. The conversation had encouraged people to think more deeply about how they participate in public dialogue. Days later, fans were still discussing Meryl's line, "Don't confuse urgency with wisdom." The phrase became a widely shared quote within this fictional narrative, appearing in posts, comments, and discussions about the pressure to respond instantly in modern media culture. Back in the studio, as the applause faded and the cameras prepared to cut away, Whoopi looked at Meryl one last time. "Thank you for this conversation," Whoopi said sincerely. Meryl smiled warmly. "Thank you for asking the questions." The audience applauded once more as the closing music began to play. The screen slowly faded to black. And then one final message appeared for viewers. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the conversation between Meryl Streep and Whoopi Goldberg in this imagined scenario? Share your opinion in the comments below, and let us know which moment stood out to you the most. And if you want more stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Prime Spotlight, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.